Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a senior professional with a deep understanding of culture from the US, Mr. Charlie Sull. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ashutosh.
Thank you. Charlie is the co founder of Culture X. Uh, he's an expert in corporate culture and AI. He's the co-creator of Measuring Culture, the most read series in MIT Sloan Management Review history, and he's a podcast host of a podcast titled Culture Champions. So, Charlie, before we talk culture, tell me a little bit about your own journey and what got you interested in culture.
Yeah, well, our interest in culture stems from work we did before in strategy and strategy execution. And we did all this research and we kept on bumping across this massive invisible force that everyone understands exists
Mhm.
and everyone understands is very important, but they don't necessarily know very much about it. And in your
Mm,
own company, what is your culture?
mm,
People tend not to have very good answers to questions like these.
mm,
So we were just very interested in this massive, powerful, invisible force and how to demystify it, and specifically how to measure it.
mm. Well said. And how do you define corporate culture? And there are so many different cultures. So I wanted your perspective. How do you define corporate culture and why is it critical for business success today?
Yeah, so you're right. There are a lot of different definitions of culture. Luckily, they're beginning to converge, at least in academic circles, around Charles O'Reilly and Jenny Chapman's definition of culture. And ours is quite consistent with that. So basically, we think of culture as a company's operating system that
Mhm.
governs thousands of consequential decisions within the firm. So, for instance, one algorithm that a company's operating system could govern is my direct report just made a mistake. Is it okay in this company to yell at him and kind of lose my temper, or is that not acceptable? That's a
Mm,
cultural algorithm around respect.
mm,
Or another one, for instance, is I'm a distributed manager in Sweden, and I just noticed a changing market condition.
mm,
So what should I do? Should I
mm.
respond proactively to this changing market condition and
Yeah.
take ownership and speedily respond? Or
Mm,
should I report back to headquarters and wait a couple weeks for them to get back to me and address the situation that way? That's a cultural algorithm around agility and ownership. So culture encompasses hundreds of these topics like respect or agility, anything ranging from cross-unit collaboration to psychological safety, to how pet friendly the culture is. Culture encompasses a lot of these things.
mm,
And when you think of culture as an operating system this way, you can see how incredibly important it is, not just for the employee experience, which is how it's typically thought of, but also for financial value creation.
great
And
response.
sure enough, to answer the second part of your question,
Yeah.
there's a lot of great research about um, the financial importance of culture, why it matters for the bottom line. There was a great study done at Duke, surveying about 1,400 CEOs and CFOs of mostly large companies, and it found that the majority of them thought that culture was a top three driver of financial value
Mm,
creation out of any conceivable driver of value creation, like
yeah.
strategy or CEO or anything like that.
Mm,
And there was great work done by Alex Edmonds, who was at Wharton at the time, who found that a strong employee experience culture alone
mm,
is associated with a 24% premium in total shareholder returns over 5 years. So
mm.
for big companies, culture is a multi-billion dollar phenomenon.
Absolutely. And I completely agree with what you've just said. But therefore, a follow-up question for you is how do leaders ensure that corporate culture aligns with the company's strategic goals and values?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The first step is ensuring what is the strategy and is the strategy strong? So a lot of companies, as you know, don't have strategies. So,
Yeah.
if you don't have a strategy, it's going to be hard for the culture to align with it.
Mm,
And then the next step is actually relatively straightforward. You just have to look through what is your strategy. So, for instance, if your strategy is you have a portfolio of different companies and you want to integrate them more tightly,
Mm,
you consider that aspect of the strategy, and then you ask the question, what needs to go right culturally to support this strategy? So in this case of integration, you would need cross-unit collaboration, among probably other things.
mm,
And then the real work begins. What is the state of cross-unit collaboration in the company? And then this gets back to the question of cultural measurement. You need an effective way to actually measure
mm.
whether employees are effectively collaborating across
Yeah,
unit in your company.
yeah.
And once you have effective cultural measurement, you can not only understand what is the state of cultural measure of cross-unit collaboration, how does that benchmark to peers, where is it breaking down and succeeding within the organization. But by analyzing employee feedback, you can also understand how employees speak about cross-unit collaboration,
Mm,
why they say it's breaking down,
mm,
and the highest impact ways to fix it.
mm. Well said. And Charlie, I'm going to come to measuring culture, but I have two more questions relating to understanding it. How do leadership styles influence corporate culture, and what role should leaders play to shape culture?
Yeah, so the role of leadership, especially top leadership, is absolutely crucial for culture. I mean,
Yeah.
they're in some ways synonymous. I mean, if you're trying to manage a culture,
Mm,
you need to pull on a variety of levers. So everything from promotion decisions to compensation and benefits to work design, all these different levers. And in most companies, the only people with access to all those levers are going to be the executive leaders.
mm,
And that's not to mention the importance of social norms.
mm,
So if you see your executive leadership embodying certain traits like innovation, this is going to trickle all the way down the organization, and employees further down the line are going to try to replicate those behaviors. So really, the top team especially, and of course, distributed leaders have a role because they can influence microcultures, and that can be consequential too. But especially senior leader, executive leadership, their role in culture is absolutely vital.
mm. Well said. But the other perspective I wanted to get from you is that post COVID, the whole game in working has changed, and now you've got hybrid working, you've got work from home, remote work, etc., etc. How has these different forms of work impacted corporate culture?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And the answer, our best answer to this question, which we glean by analyzing millions of Glassdoor reviews, what employees say they like about the company, what they dislike about the company in free text. Uh, in 2019, before the rise of remote work compared to 2024,
Mm,
um, surprisingly, culture in broad strokes at the meta level has changed maybe less than you would think. So when
mm,
employees speak about key topics, including collaboration, ownership, things you'd be expect to be heavily impacted by the rise of hybrid work. There actually aren't as large changes as you would think. So you might think that the state of culture has completely changed.
yeah.
That's not what our research finds. However, we do have, we're still working on this research, but we have some preliminary findings that at least if you have very high levels of remote work, so
Mm,
significantly higher than your industry level, than
mhm,
your industry average, this is associated with significantly or at least noticeable decreases in cultural performance across a
mm,
variety of dimensions, including things like ownership, collaboration, and even toxic culture. So we have some evidence that if you take remote work to an extreme, this can be associated with decreased cultural
mm.
performance.
Yeah, well said. Charlie, let's now talk about measuring culture. And you have developed the ability or the technique to be able to use AI to not only measure but also improve. What was the reason for you to use AI as a tool to measure and improve culture?
Yeah, so we started this research about 10 years ago. We were interested in what is culture and how to improve it. And very early on, we discovered that the biggest bottleneck to improving culture was effectively measuring it.
Hmm.
The reason for that is because the way the vast majority of companies measure culture is with technology from 1932. So they're
Mhm.
going to do a long engagement survey every year that has dozens of these repetitive 1 to 5 point scale questions, and that's how you measure culture. One of the challenges with this is when employees are faced with these dozens of repetitive questions,
Mhm.
they zone out and go on autopilot, and they answer almost every question with almost the same answer. So we did a study of 900,000 employees responding to questions like these, and we found the average employee in the study answers 90% of questions with the same two answers. Okay. So
Yes.
it's just very repetitive, unvaried, and I would say quite low quality data. And the problem with that is if what you're trying to capture is culture, which is this incredibly sophisticated, multidimensional, complex, nuanced phenomenon, and the data you're using is this very repetitive, simple, kind of low quality data,
Hmm.
then it's just going to be too blunt of an instrument to effectively measure the thing you're trying to measure.
Hmm.
And what's not a blunt instrument is employees' natural language. So when employees just naturally speak about a company, what they like about it, what they dislike about it,
Hmm.
they talk about hundreds of nuanced topics, and they can go into all kinds of detail and capture all kinds of complexity. So
Right.
natural language is an effective way to measure culture, and
Hmm.
this led us to develop an AI platform that leverages natural language to accomplish this.
Well said. But the other perspective I wanted from you was that how can AI tools assist in diagnosing cultural problems before they lead to broader organizational challenges?
Well, you can ask the question, how can employees surface these
Hmm.
problems before they lead to these bigger problems? I mean,
Mhm.
if you just listen to employees' words, you
Yeah.
can capture these issues and nip them in the bud.
Hmm.
But the first order issue isn't even identifying problems before they happen. It's identifying the existing problems,
Yeah.
which, thanks to the existing state of cultural measurement, usually aren't identified. So
Hmm.
really, I mean, and when we work with clients, we'll identify some issues that'll probably happen in the future. But the main thing we're identifying is the kind of issues that are right there that employees are kind of speaking and
Hmm.
yelling about, but that haven't yet been identified by leadership.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And how do you address the challenges, if any, of biases in AI models when you're trying to measure something as nuanced as culture?
Yeah, I mean the basic thing you want to do is always keep humans in the loop and
Hmm.
always keep subject matter experts in the loop.
Hmm.
So especially if you're using LLMs to build a culture AI platform, which is probably the way most people would do it now,
Hmm.
um, you have to be very careful about things like the topics are consistent. When you measure the same body of text twice, you're getting the same or very similar answers both times, and that these topics are linked to research about what culture actually is, and you're not just letting the large language model kind of freestyle
Hmm.
and do things you don't want. So there are all sorts of things like that. I mean, hallucinations you have to worry about, a lot of things with LLMs, but basically the solution to most of the challenges with AI is having subject matter experts be very, very closely involved in the process. And in
Hmm.
fact, the way we did it, we do use LLMs, of course, to some extent, but this is actually a rules-based approach that we developed over the course of 10 years in collaboration with leading professors from places like Harvard and Stanford.
Hmm.
And our technique was having very, very close supervision of the classification to ensure that it's always consistent with what reasonable people would think of when they think about culture. So I would say, it's there. I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty of things that could go wrong when you measure culture with AI, but normally the solution for most of them is to keep subject matter experts closely in the loop.
And given the access to AI, what metrics or KPIs should a leader be following or tracking using AI to understand how they're managing their own culture?
Well, with AI, they'll be able to understand how their employees speak about hundreds of different topics. So,
Mm,
how employees speak about psychological safety, what percentage of employees say that's going well, what percentage of
mm,
employees say it's going poorly. And you can do this for hundreds of different topics.
mm,
And then for each of these topics, you'll be able to understand things like how does the topic benchmark versus my peers externally? Within the company, how does, for instance, HR compare to other functions across demographic segments of the company?
mm,
You'll be able to understand what are the most powerful drivers of the employee experience that you might want to focus on, especially. You'll be able to understand how the culture is changing over time.
mm,
And this isn't necessarily a metric, but you'll be able to understand in detail what employees say about the topic. So, what is the context of the topic? How does it work? How does it live for employees? And crucially, by understanding this information, you'll be able to identify high impact ways to improve the topic.
mm.
So basically, you just understand the answers to two questions. What is the state of the culture? And what are the highest impact ways to improve the culture?
Amazing. Let's now change gears and talk a little bit about culture champions and leadership. What is the role of storytelling in creating and sustaining corporate culture?
Mm, there's some role of storytelling, but I'd say it's relatively unimportant. I
Mhm.
really the key dynamic with culture is listening to employees, listening to what they say, and responding to the pain points.
Mm,
So it's not necessarily crafting these narratives. I mean, that can sometimes be helpful, but what's going to be much more effective than telling telling a compelling story about why psychological safety matters
mm.
is having leaders actually embody psychological
Yeah,
safety.
yeah.
And then their direct reports are going to see that this is the behavior that's encouraged within the company, and this is what I'm going to do. So I don't want to say that storytelling has no role in the culture. Of course, when you're trying to make any case, it's helpful to have a narrative, especially if you can ground it in
Right.
data. But really, what matters is responding to employee pain points, fixing those problems, and having leaders model the desired
Mm,
behaviors.
Well said. And how, based on all your research, how do top leaders of some of the world's strongest cultures sustain high levels of employee engagement and morale? And give me an example if you can.
Uh, this is a lot of what we do in our podcast. We interview the CEOs and CHROs of many of the world's strongest cultures that also excel financially.
Yeah.
And it's different things in different cases. I mean, culture
Mm,
is not one size fits all. The culture of Hermes is very different than the culture of the Lego Group, even though
mm,
they're both very strong. But I would say if there's one unifying theme, what maybe two unifying themes.
mm,
It's that leadership cares about employees.
mm,
So
mm,
this might sound simple, but actually, if you look at the data, in the majority of companies, employees are more likely to say that their company doesn't care about them than that their company does care about them.
mm,
So showing employees that you care. And then effectively listening to employees, understanding their pain points, and responding to them.
mm,
That's really the process, which is basically an employee listening process,
mm.
that's most likely to ensure um, that employees are satisfied. And unfortunately, that does not happen
Does
too
not happen.
effectively in
I
many
was just going to
companies.
say, You make it sound so simple, and yet it's very difficult for so many leaders to be able to not just understand, but even respond. Thank you. Uh, my next question, Charlie, is that based on all your experience, how do companies with strong culture handle crises differently from others?
Yeah, culture is a really big advantage in crisis management. So we were actually talking to Manny Mesita, he was the CEO of Bain, Bain and Company, is now
Mm,
the chairman. And one of the great points he made in this conversation was when Bain was experiencing crisis. I mean, it's just
mm,
similar crises that most companies were experiencing, like COVID or the war in the Ukraine.
mm.
Um, Bain had the real advantage of having this North Star. That's how he put it. So
Yeah.
they had the Bain operating principles that provided simple rules and guidance that kind of allowed for more stability in the face of all these difficult decisions that they were making. Because if you don't have this strong cultural North Star, then it becomes much more difficult to respond to all this uncertainty and complexity
Mm,
and turbulence than if you have this these principles already firmly embedded that you don't even really have to think about because they're
yeah.
just a part of the fabric of your company.
Mm,
And we hear similar things from other strong cultures.
mm,
So one way culture operates is as these very firm, simple rules that are very helpful, especially in periods of
mm.
turbulence.
Amazing. Time for two more questions for you. What advice would you give to organizations looking to start their measurement of culture and improvement using AI?
Well, if they've already made the decision to measure culture using AI, that's an incredibly important step. I mean, the two main ways that culture goes wrong is by far the most common is it's simply not prioritized. So the executive team isn't prioritizing culture. If you've already made the decision to prioritize culture, then you're well ahead of the curve already, no
Yeah.
matter what else you do.
Mm,
The second most common way for culture to go wrong is, okay, we're going to prioritize this, but we don't understand what's going on.
mm,
How do we measure it? And
mm,
they measure it with ineffective systems, normally this 1 to 5 scale Likert survey that was developed
mm,
in 1932,
mm,
it does not effectively measure culture.
mm,
So if you've made the decision to prioritize culture and measure it using AI, you're well ahead of the curve. I mean, the next step is to simply choose a partner to help you measure the culture, or you can also build cultural measurement systems in-house using AI. And both of those approaches are good. So I would maybe my
thank you.
advice at this stage isn't really too helpful, but I would say really just keep on what you're doing, review the market, review the options for building these capabilities internally, do what you think is best for your company, and if you need any help, I'm more than happy to talk to you.
And my last question, um, how do you see AI shaping corporate culture in the forthcoming few years?
Yeah, we'll see. It's an interesting question. I mean, we'll see if this new kind of cultural measurement takes off because really the big bottleneck to it taking off in spectacular fashion isn't the superiority of the technology, which
Mm,
is self-evident. It's whether companies prioritize culture in the first place.
mm,
And what we've seen is for most companies, culture is synonymous with the employee
mm,
experience. So if it's difficult to retain employees, then you care a lot about culture, like it was a couple of years ago during the Great
mm,
Resignation.
mm,
But if it's easy to retain employees, like it is now, where the labor market is pretty hard for job seekers,
mm,
um, then culture gets heavily deprioritized, and that's where we are in the cycle now.
mm,
So really, the success and growth of culture AI is going to be determined by how much companies prioritize culture in the first place, which, to be honest, at the moment does not look too encouraging. Although, of course, there are some companies that always prioritize culture.
mm,
But hopefully that changes. I think probably the biggest factors are going to be whether the labor market becomes more friendly to employees and job
Yeah.
seekers, and also the extent to which AI in general replaces human jobs. Because if you don't need humans, if you're not trying to attract them, then for most companies, culture is going to be less of a priority.
Wow. And on that note, Charlie, I just want to say thank you so much for speaking to me. What an amazing conversation I've had with you today. I thought I understood the corporate world very well after having lived and worked in it for 4 decades, but I learned new things from you today. I didn't, for example, have any idea that since the 1930s, there's been almost no change till,
Almost no change.
till AI has been brought in and you're making some paradigm changes in the way leaders are going to start thinking about corporate culture. Thank you for talking to me about AI, about measuring culture, and of course, about your own experiences on how you are analyzing culture, which I believe is such a critical part of every single organization. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.